I want to welcome everyone to the Ocean Policy Advisory Council meeting in Salem, Oregon. My name is Gina Carter. I'm with the Nature Conservancy as the Coastal Marine Director, and I sit here in OPAC in the statewide conservation seat. I also have the opportunity to thank you for serving as your chair at OPAC, and I'm grateful that you all made time in your schedule today to travel and come here so that we can have a productive meeting together. Before we get started, I want to thank Andy, Patty, Deanna, and others for helping set up this meeting, and for the OPAC Executive Committee for coming up with an excellent agenda for us today. I also want to give special recognition to Lorinda. She's not in the room. I can't recognize her.
She had to go run an errand.
Well, alright, actually this is maybe better. While she's running an errand, I want to say this is her last meeting before retirement. So we have a card that is going around for her. So if you could please sign it. And then we'll give her a little gift later this afternoon and thank her for all of her hard work and effort over the many years for OPAC. Now it will still be a surprise. I also want to recognize that we have a new OPAC member, Commissioner David Yamamoto. So I don't know if you want to take a moment to introduce yourself and tell us about your interest in OPAC. I'm sure we all know, but
I appreciate that very much. I've been on the outskirts of OPAC for many years, and I appreciate very much the opportunity to sit on OPAC. Terry Thompson's seat. I know everyone knows that Terry had some health issues recently, but I understand he's getting much better at this point. He's home, doing well, preventing failure. I look forward to my participation on OPAC. This has always been a very important aspect of the state of Oregon. We'll see, and hope things that happen. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Again, I'm the newbie here, so I'm going to be looking to everyone for advice and consultations. I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
well, we're glad you're here. Welcome aboard. Do we have any other elected officials with us in the audience today? Brett, do you want to stand up?
Not elected, but Fritz Graham, the field representative for Senator Wyden, covered Lincolnville and Clatsop County.
Thank you for being here. So now we're going to go around the room and have all the OPAC members introduce themselves. If you could state your name and organization, what seat you're filling on OPAC, and if you could tell us one good thing that's happened to you recently.
Starting with me. Great. My name is Malia Masiba. I am new to the Department of State Lands as their legislative and policy analyst, and so I'll be joining OPAC as Department of State Lands liaison. I'm looking forward to participating with this organization. I've been aware of OPAC and its work through my previous job as Chief of Staff for State Representative Patty McEwen for quite some time, and so familiar a little with OPAC. I'm looking forward to working with you all. I will apologize. I was the kind of new person for the legislature at DSL, and with the legislative deadline where it is this week, I'll be ducking out at the end of the morning and returning to the building for the rest of the day. But so again, my name's Malia. I know this is kind of hidden over here. And one good thing that's happened to me recently is that as of Sunday, I just moved into a new place, and so my daughter and I are really excited to be settling into a larger space that's across the street from my work. So convenient and beautiful, and we're really excited about it.
I don't know if we need this in our mouth right now, but I'm Melissa Kaiser, and I'm on the Coastal Conservation or Environmental Organization seat, and I work for the City of Cannon Beach directing our Haystack Rock Awareness Program. And one amazing thing that has happened to me, and now all of you, once I tell you, is that puffins have officially returned to Haystack Rock as of this morning. It's very exciting. Got a lot of blurry pictures. It's wonderful.
Hi everyone, I'm Bryn Hudson. I am subbing in for Jason Miner in the Governor's Natural Resources Office seat. I am also a Sea Grant Fellow. One good thing that happened to me, I went wine tasting on Saturday. It was awesome.
My name is Charlie Cliven. I work for Surfrider Foundation, and I represent non-fishing recreation on OPAC. And one good thing that's happened to me, well, how about for the state of Oregon? We passed legislation that permanent moratorium on oil and gas drilling in the Territory Sea.
My name's Richard Heath. I'm from Brookings. I represent the South Coast Charter Sport and Recreational Fisheries. Best thing that happened to me is when I come to Salem, I get to visit my 6-year-old granddaughter. So we had dinner last night, and we have a 4-month-old grand dog now, a new Labrador. Break in, so I got to see him.
I'm Karen Brady, Marine Manager for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I'm in the VFW seat. I spent last week, which was spring break, with my 8-year-old twin boys driving around parts of Oregon, including an area where I got to see sandhill cranes for the first time, and not only did I see like 100 of them in the field, they're big birds, but I saw the male doing like the dance, to try and entice the females. It was fabulous. So that's the best thing.
Hi everyone, I'm Deanna Carciolo. I'm the Rocky Shores Coordinator with the LCD Oregon Coastal Program and OPAC staff. But I guess one good thing that happened to me, I just started sewing, and I just made the first garment that's not embarrassing.
Walter Chuck, Vice Chair of OPAC, Commissioner for the Port of Newport, representing ports, marine transportation, navigation, and a good thing that happened and bad. My son moved out last month, so we are now empty nesters, but he did have a car left in our driveway, and he just sold it yesterday. So now we have our driveway and our garage all to ourselves. And now it's up to him and his daughter and my daughter to start getting their stuff out of the house so we can have our own room.
I'm Steve Shipsey, and I'm counsel to the council. And for people that were at the last council meeting, the good news that I'd share is that I actually made it to my son's meet on time and did medicine.
Patty Snow, Coastal Program Manager with the Department of Land Conservation and Development. I'd say, our son has graduated from high school, and then he's been accepted at OSU, so hopefully that's where he'll be this coming fall.
I want to reintroduce myself once more so I can give everyone an opportunity to understand what my most favorite thing that just happened, and I didn't even know about it. Again, I'm sorry, I'm Dave Yamamoto, Toledo County Commissioner. Several people have told me this morning that they heard me on the radio this morning. I have not heard that. But I think it was about the issue of aerial spraying and state forest lands. And I was at the Environment and Natural Resource Committee yesterday to testify. Thank you.
I'm John Holloway, North Coast Charter Sport and Recreational Fisheries. This one working?
I don't think the microphones are working at all.
I'm hearing them through the speakers, so if you stop pointing.
Okay, Andy, I can keep going. Okay, a good thing that happened is a contractor finished building a brand new house for my wife and I in Garibaldi, and it was very expensive, so I referred to it to the county commissioners as our unaffordable housing. But the good news, we mitigated for it. We had a single-wide manufactured home on the property that was donated to a landowner and moved. And now it's an affordable housing rental.
Chris Walls with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. Good thing for us, not nearly as cool as a house, but my chickens are finally laying eggs. I'm very happy about that.
Shelby Walker, I'm the Director of Oregon Sea Grant, ex officio member on Huron OPAC. I think one piece of good news is after last year having 0 applicants to the Sea Grant Knaus Fellowship, which places applicants in DC for a year, students, we are advancing 6, which is our maximum amount that we can put forward to the national competition. Very exciting, incredible students, and we'll see where they go.
Hello everyone, my name is Ryan Hoof. For those who don't know or hadn't heard, Jennifer Purcell has actually moved along from DEQ. She'll still be working on regional solutions team issues for the North Coast, but from the perspective of the governor's office. So I'm going to be taking over as DEQ's representative on OPAC. Found that out on Friday, so I'm really happy to be here. I've been at DEQ for about 10 years. Most of that time has been spent developing and implementing the ballast water program, working with the commercial shipping industry. Prior to my time at DEQ, I spent about 12 years in research in zooplankton ecology. So I've been familiar in various ways with some of OPAC's work, and so really look forward to working with you. Oh, and something good that's happened to me, my youngest daughter just got a new bike, so we can commute. I can ride her to her school in the morning, so that's great.
Good morning, Lauren Goddard, City Councilman for Depot Bay and operator of Dockside Charters. Charlie, or rather Walter, the empty nest syndrome is a myth. You will be very joyous every day. If you want to talk to the kids, pick up the phone.
We envy.
And that's the voice of experience speaking there. Now, as a mariner, it's often said that the happiest day of your life, and there are two happiest days in your lives, when you buy a boat and when you sell a boat. Yesterday, now, I really didn't want to sell the boat because it's a really fun boat, because it's fast and handles really well, burns incredible amounts of fuel. But the high point for me yesterday was I sold a boat that I had for sale for more money than I wanted for it. So it's a good day.
Well, thank you, everyone. And I was wondering, can we also go to the phone? I think that we have some OPAC members on the phone.
I'll go first. I'm Susan Chambers. Sorry, I couldn't be there in person. Getting over a cold. I'm with the West Coast Youth Processors Association, and I've been in the Southern Commercial Fisheries Seat. One good thing that's happened to me lately is I was selected to be the artist for the Oregon Coast Youth Association this year for their annual poster. And I painted a picture of the octopus Octavius, who was at the Charleston Marine Life Center in Charleston. So thank you for letting me participate by phone, and I'll see a lot of you next week at the council meeting.
Well, we hope you feel better soon. Are there any other OPAC members on the phone? And are there any, no, now we're going to go to folks in the audience and the general public. Is there anyone from the general public on the phone who's following? Just introduce yourself, please. All right, doesn't sound like anyone. So we'll go to the back of the room. If you could just introduce yourself and where you're from and your name, that'd be great. Which side wants to start? Thank you.
Stacey Johnson in U.S. Senator Jeff Merkley's office.
Thank you.
I'm Ann Hayden-Lesmeister. I'm an Oregon Sea Grant Fellow, the STAG Fellow.
Peggy Joyce, League of Women Voters.
Paul Shibley, Pew Charitable Trust.
Fritz Graham, Senator White's office.
Laurel Hellman, Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. Julia Kelly, ODFW.
Dave Fox, ODFW.
Joe Levisite, Portland Audubon.
Joseph Yoren, Audubon Society, Lincoln City.
Jocelyn Hennebolson, Marine Policy Enthusiast.
Tara Brock, the Pew Charitable Trust.
Great. Thank you all for joining. All right, so with that, we are going to move to our next agenda item, which is looking at the December meeting summary. You should all have a copy of that in your packets. I will, if you're missing a copy, let us know. We can make sure that you can get it into your hands right now. Hopefully you've all had a chance to look at the summary for a few minutes, see if there's any edits you'd like to make. I do want to note we don't call them minutes because they're not a verbatim record of what occurred, but rather the official records are kept on a video, and this is just a summary of the key highlights and decisions that were made. Does anyone have any edits or corrections they would like to propose? I just have one, which I sent in yesterday. just to review the agenda for a few minutes. So going over the agenda today, we are going to have a full day. We're going to hear a legislative update, go over part 5 and part 3 of Rocky Shores, have a working lunch, where we're going to learn more about the potential for sea otter introduction in the Oregon coast. We're going to learn about the NOAA aquarium program, what's happening, our aquaculture program, what's happening in the aquaculture program, and talk about marine reserves. We also are going to add to the agenda about a 10-minute presentation at the 4:15 hour to hear from Charlie on the marine debris action plan. Just a little brief summary and a preview of what we may do in the fall. And one thing I do want to point out, as you may recall, we did a kind of visioning process in last spring up until December. In that visioning process, we discussed our top priorities for what we want to do for meeting in the spring and in the fall. So this agenda is a direct reflection of the priorities that OPAC said what they want to do. So I want to appreciate or acknowledge all of your input in helping form this agenda. I also want to foreshadow a little bit of our fall agenda, where we will continue our learning into aquaculture. We'll get an update on ODFW's nearshore seafloor mapping process and progress. We'll discuss the seafloor inventory and other topics. So that's just a preview of what we'll be doing in the fall. Are there any questions about the agenda or any agenda items that are missing? Okay. So with that, we are going to proceed to the legislative update portion of the agenda. We do have a guest from the governor's office coming to join us from 10 to 10:20. So I think what we'll do for now is maybe start tackling a few topics, and then when she gets here, we will take pause. We'll do cap and invest legislation update, and then we'll go back to other updates. So I think I want to welcome Bryn Hudson. She's with the Oregon Sea Grant Fellow Program and is in the governor's office, helping us on all ocean policy issues, which is fantastic. So between Bryn and agency staff, we're going to hear about an update on the bills moving through the legislative session and other issues that may be of interest during the session.
Alright, so I'm going to give 3 updates or 4 updates that don't really have anything to do with the legislature, but you guys might be interested in. So the governor announced her and launched her Wildfire Response Council on the 18th of March. So this council is going to take a 6-month in-depth look at wildfire suppression, mitigation, and community adaptation and recovery. And there's going to be 3 technical subcommittees regarding those specific topics to sort of, with experts, to sort of help address wildfire response in the state of Oregon. There's 19 members on this council, and they're going to be meeting monthly until September. And I believe those meetings are open to the public. The Columbia Basin Partnership finalized their Phase 1 report that established quantitative and qualitative goals for long-term salmon and steelhead recovery. That Phase 1 report has been submitted to the Marine Fisheries Advisory Council, or it will be later in April, and it will be reviewed and hopefully approved. And then Phase 2 work is underway in developing a priority list of actions in order to achieve those qualitative and quantitative goals set forth by Phase 1. At the end of last year, the Columbia River Dam Agreement was reached between Oregon, Washington, the Nez Perce Tribe, Bonneville Power Association, or Administration, BLM, and the Army Corps of Engineers to sort of agree on how to balance power generation and salmon passage by timing spills to maximize power and also allow for fish passage along the Columbia River. There's also a Tsunami line working group that has been established in collaboration with the Coastal Caucus. The function of this work group is to explore possibilities for potential updates to statutes concerning construction and regulations of certain buildings and structures that are vulnerable to tsunami inundation and earthquakes on the coast. There will be 3 to 5 meetings between February, which obviously has already happened, and June. And the work group's goal is to make recommendations to Governor's Office staff, which may result in future legislation regarding the tsunami line. So that kind of wraps up my non-legislative updates. Other legislative updates for this session, as Charlie mentioned, Senate Bill 256 repealed the sunset for a moratorium on oil, gas, and sulfur leasing until the sea. That was signed in by Governor on the 27th of March. Senate Bill 260, which appropriates about $2 million to the Ocean Science Trust, ODFW, and the Higher Education Coordinating Commission for ocean acidification and hypoxia research. That bill has passed the Senate, their representative Senate Policy Committee, and it's been referred to Ways and Means, which they'll kind of suss out those details of how much money, and when it'll be appropriated. Senate Bill 753 authorizes the Ocean Science Trust to enter into 501c3 partnerships to accept donations and solicit gifts, grants, and donations. This kind of gives the trust a little more flexibility for having more money for research and other projects. That bill has passed the Senate completely, and now it is sitting in the House Natural Resources Committee awaiting to get a hearing. There is a small House Bill 2574 requires the DLCD to establish an electronic information system to receive, consolidate, and organize public record information concerning shellfish mariculture in Oregon. That one is appropriates money, so it's in the Joint Ways and Means Committee at the moment. It's in the House Natural Resources Committee, and once it passes out of that committee, it'll go to Joint Ways and Means, where it'll get either funded or not funded. Harmful algal blooms is a big topic this year as well. House Bill 3326 declares harmful algal blooms to be a menace to public health and welfare, and it directs DEQ and Oregon Health Authority to monitor and identify water sources that are susceptible to harmful algal blooms and develop advisory alert protocols. That one is going to have a work session on the 4th, so that will be tomorrow. And they are in the midst of some amendment processes to sort of clean up that bill and hopefully get that passed. And then there is a slew of plastic legislation. Senate Bill 90, House Bill 2509, and House Bill 2883 are all scheduled for work sessions tomorrow in the representative policy committees. Senate Bill 90 is a plastic straw upon request bill. So you would have to get a straw. You have to ask to get a straw rather than just being supplied with a plastic straw. House Bill 2509 is a plastic bag ban, and then House Bill 2883 is a polystyrene, aka styrofoam, ban in the state. So that is all I have from the governor's office, and so I will kick that off. I'll answer questions if anyone has any, and I'll answer to the best of my ability, and then I'll kick it off to agencies.
Great, thank you for that. Are there any questions about those specific bills? Either you're kind of in the world and tracking it, or it's just maybe mildly of interest, but there's a lot of things happening for the environment this session, so that's great. Patty, do you have anything you want to add from an agency perspective?
Actually, not from a state legislative action, but I did want to bring up, I was going to take this opportunity, if that's possible, to bring up the president's budget. I think Bryn covered the bills that would be of interest to OPAC from the state, from our perspective. So did want to mention that recently in March, the president came out with his proposed budget for 2020, which again zeroed out coastal zone management money as well as sea grant money. And so in prior years, OPAC has sent a letter to the governor, but actually, and there's a draft letter, 5A, I believe it is, to Governor Kate Brown, encouraging funding for coastal zone management as well as sea grant, because they're important to the coastal economy and folks who live on the coast and the state of Oregon. So we are hoping, we have a draft letter there, and so we're hoping that OPAC will forward another letter in this year if possible. And available for any questions that you might have. I might add that, so this would be the third year Congress has funded coastal zone management and sea grant the last 2 years, so we're certainly hoping that they follow in that trend this year.
Yeah, Yeah, so as Patty was saying, there is a letter in the back of your packets that, would be from OPAC to Governor Brown, basically asking that the state provided support to Congress and, for Coastal Zone Management Act program and also for Sea Grant. This is very similar to a letter that we've sent in previous years because, as Patty said, this has been a reoccurring theatrics that we've been going through where the president zeroes it out, Congress funds it, and we really appreciate the support of all of our congressional delegation and all the committees in Congress that make sure these funds actually don't disappear. So it's very important on the ground and really impacts what we're doing on the coast. So, I can't recall, did we just kind of agree via head nods we were gonna send this letter, or do you want an actual motion? Chris?
I'll fix it so I can raise my card, sorry. Because I'm a federal employee and my program is funded sometimes through this, through the congressional budget, I would need my name redacted from the OPAC letter on this letterhead, please, if it goes forward.
Okay. Thank you for that, and we also, I don't think that Commissioner Yamamoto is on here, so we can add you to the letterhead. Yep. So is there a motion to draft this letter and send it?
Yeah, I'd make a motion to accept the draft letter that was in the OPAC packet, support NOAA coastal zone programs in Oregon.
Corrections.
With corrections.
Great, is there a second? Great, thank you. So there's a motion to transmit this letter as drafted with corrections to the governor's office in support of these two programs. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Susan, do you want to vote?
She says yes.
Okay, great. That's okay, no, it's helpful. If I ever forget you, Susan, please chime up either through the computer or just feel free to just shout to the speaker.
No worries, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, great. So I noticed that Kristen Sharan has joined us. She's the Energy and Climate Change Policy Advisor for the Governor. And so if you could join us up by a microphone. We're really grateful that you're here today. I know the legislative session is insane. There's many, many complications and opportunities in this bill that you're going to tell us about. But for some background for you, Kristen, this group is really interested in the House Bill 2020.
Okay.
And in particular, maybe how it might relate to the oceans or the work that, might be whatever you were interested in here.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for your interest in House Bill 2020. House Bill 2020 is a proposal to create a cap and trade, or what's sometimes called a cap and invest program here in Oregon. And if Oregon passes this legislation, we would indeed be the second state in the country to have such a program applied, economy-wide across multiple sectors. The work on House Bill 2020 has actually been many years in the making. Oregon's been having a conversation about a statewide cap and trade program to attach a price to carbon emissions and drive down emissions levels to levels consistent with Oregon's legislative goals around climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. Some would argue for the better part of a decade, but really the last few years in particular, the momentum and urgency behind moving a program like this has been growing steadily. There have been bills introduced into the legislature to create some version of cap and trade for the last 3 or 4 years. Last year in 2018, the legislative session ended with a commitment on the part of the Senate President, the Speaker, and the Governor to make 2019 the year that they would prioritize moving forward on a cap and trade program in Oregon. And in the interim, two things happened. The legislature created a joint committee on carbon reduction, which met in an interim capacity regularly last spring, throughout the summer and fall, and has now been replaced by a joint committee that's been meeting throughout the session. And they created a carbon policy office out of the executive branch to basically head up a lot of the the research and stakeholder engagement to inform a proposal that would go before the legislature in 2019. And so that's where we are today. In my capacity as the governor's climate and energy policy advisor, I've been heading up that effort with the Carbon Policy Office with a small team. House Bill 2020 was introduced at the end of January. So I'll just talk a little bit about process, then I'll talk about the substance of what's in there, and particularly the connections to oceans and ocean health. It was, process-wise, it was introduced at the end of January. The Joint Committee on Carbon Reduction then hosted a series of hearings where they took public testimony. They then went out on the road where they held meetings in different locations across the state to make sure that they were gathering citizen input from all corners of Oregon. They took that feedback into account and last week released a draft amendment called the -31 amendment that basically keeps the same general structure of a cap and invest program, but included enough sort of technical fixes as well as some substantive policy changes that it warranted a full-on sort of, what they call a gut and stuff, so sort of a rewrite of the bill from what had been introduced in January. So the -31 amendment is what's actively being discussed right now in the legislature, anticipate that they will soon start taking public comment and feedback on that -31 amendment. So what does House Bill 2020 do? As I mentioned, it creates sort of a cap and trade or cap and invest program for Oregon. What does that mean? What it means is that it establishes a gradually declining cap on the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions emitted in Oregon across certain sectors, the sectors that are regulated by the program. That includes electricity, it includes natural gas, it includes transportation, and it includes emissions from certain large industrial emitters who exceed a certain emissions threshold. So those are the sectors that are included. It's roughly about 80% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions would be covered by this program. When the program becomes active in 2021 as proposed, there would be a cap on the total amount of emissions, and that cap would slowly decline over time until it reaches a level consistent with a 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from 1990 baseline levels in the year 2035, and 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. So it's a long-term program, gradual reductions year on year to achieve targets that are consistent with what the IPCC and other international scientific bodies are now saying are consistent with reducing the worst risks associated with climate change. The way the cap is implemented is that the state basically issues allowances. You can think of them as permits, where each allowance or permit enables the holder to emit a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, so 1 ton of greenhouse gases, and the amount of allowances issued in any given period is equal to the total amount of emissions allowable in that time period. So that's how you fix that cap or you fix that limit. The allowances can be held by any of the regulated entities in any quantities. What's required is that if an entity emits emissions under this program, that whatever their emissions level is, they must surrender to the state as per their compliance an equal amount of emissions allowances or permits. How they acquire those allowances or permits can vary. They can purchase them directly from the state at state auction, where every year the state would auction a certain amount of these allowances. They would be sold in theory to the highest bidder. Entities can buy allowances from each other. That's where the trade part of cap and trade comes in. So if you have one entity that has more allowances than it needs because it was able to reduce its emissions on site, it can sell those excess allowances to another entity who needs them. But because the total amount of allowances is fixed, that's how you can be sure that emissions don't exceed those thresholds that are mandated by the cap. And in some instances, entities can be given some of their allowances for compliance purposes, and that's generally given in select circumstances when there's a public policy interest in trying to mitigate some of the cost impacts of compliance with the program. So that's the basic idea of how sort of a cap and invest program works. The flip side, we've talked a lot about sort of how the emissions piece is regulated and incented. The flip side then is what happens when the state does auction those allowances, and that generates a certain amount of proceeds from those sales that come back to the state. So House Bill 2020 goes into great length to sort of describe the process of what happens to those allowance proceeds. It talks about the creation of two accounts, one called a climate investment fund, and the second called the transportation decarbonization account. These are the two funds that any proceeds that the state receives from selling allowances, the proceeds must go into one or the other of these two accounts. The differences between the two accounts, the transportation decarbonization account is a sub-account of our state highway trust fund, and we have that account in House Bill 2020 because there's a constitutional restriction in Oregon that says that any fees raised related to the sale of motor fuel in the state of Oregon, must be deposited in the state highway trust fund and used for projects within the highway right-of-way or within the roadway. So funds from the sale of allowances to entities that sell motor vehicle fuels, be it gasoline or diesel, they go into this transportation decarbonization account, and all other funds then go into this climate investments account. In both instances, the money, the proceeds should be prioritized for projects that meet the goals of House Bill 2020, which are explicitly stated in the legislation as either reducing greenhouse gas emissions, increasing our state's capacity to adapt to and become resilient in the face of climate change, helping our natural and working landscapes sequester and store carbon emissions, and lastly, helping businesses, communities, and households with the transition to a clean energy future. So all of the monies in either account must be used for one or more of those four purposes. These are not dollars that can go to the general fund, and the legislature in the future, as these proceeds come in, will evaluate projects to ensure that they meet those criteria. And then the dollars that are in the transportation decarbonization account, they have the additional restriction of they must be spent within the highway roadway. So road improvement projects, things like culverts, things that can help stabilize slopes along roadways, those kinds of projects would be consistent with allowable uses under the program. And then lastly, I would just point out that House Bill 2020 talks a lot about sort of the types of projects and activities that the legislature would like to see prioritized with the funding that comes in eventually from this program. And again, all of it must be consistent with those four general programmatic goals. But they talk about ocean acidification, it talks about research, it does talk about prioritizing projects and activities that benefit impacted communities, where in the legislation impacted communities are described as those communities that either have been historically disadvantaged, are at the front lines of experiencing climate change impacts, have been disproportionately impacted by pollution in the past, and that includes a lot of our rural communities, a lot of our coastal communities. The idea is that proceeds should be prioritized first and foremost for projects and activities that would benefit those impacted communities, in addition to, like I said, research, talks about ocean acidification, and other kinds of projects that could potentially, I think there's some emerging research on how wetlands, for example, are a really critical and important sort of, carbon sink, sequestering and storing carbon emissions over the long term. There may be opportunities for those kinds of projects under a program like this as well. So maybe I'll stop there and allow some questions. Go further.
Just to give a little bit of scope or scale, if you, I've heard of discussions, but I don't know what the -31 amendment says. If you were to kind of guesstimate how much might be in the climate investment fund to do some of these projects for communities and others? Like what's, like are you talking 10 million or? I'm giving you a
Sure.
softball.
So we have a sort of a rough analysis online on the Carbon Policy Office website. You have to make certain assumptions. This is a market-based program, so there's a lot that we can't say for certain going into a program like this. The price of allowances, for example, will be determined in the market depending upon supply and demand. So making some assumptions about prices, how many of these allowances will actually be sold at auction. We could be looking at, in that climate investment fund, somewhere around $150 to $200 million a year once the program's up and running in the 2020s.
John?
I have more than one question.
Okay.
Go anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming and talking to us. It's very informative. You talked about the targeted industry sectors, and would there also be would there be a list of exemptions? I represent the fishing industry. I'm concerned about that.
Sure. So House Bill 2020, including the -31 amendments, has an exclusion for fuels that are sold for marine purposes. So it's meant to exclude fuels, for fishing fleets and other boats.
That would be, I think I saw in their watercraft.
Yes, I believe that's how it's described.
That would be all watercraft.
I believe so, yes.
Okay, next. I'm concerned about what it's gonna cost and, who's gonna pay it and who isn't. And how are the costs gonna be determined? Is that gonna be by statute or by rule?
The costs, it's a market-based program, so what the state will determine is, what the cap or the emission limit is each year between now and the program's end date, consistent with achieving those goals that the legislature has set for greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And it will create the market for these allowances. The price of the allowance, however, will be largely determined, by in that market, in that carbon market, depending upon the supply and demand for those allowances at a point in time. The legislature will, in the bill, direct the agency to determine a price floor, so the lowest price that the state would accept in exchange for selling an allowance, as well as a hard price ceiling, the highest price that an allowance could sell for. But allowances would likely sell somewhere in between, depending upon, again, the conditions in the market. How many entities find that they need to hold these allowances to account for their emissions versus the amount of emissions reductions they can accomplish because they find that to be less expensive than purchasing an allowance. And then, depending upon, the sector, that will determine, what those impacts are for those regulated entities, and then whatever indirect impacts those might have, on end users sort of come out of that. It doesn't, this isn't, it's a market-based program, so it's hard to determine in advance. There have been some economic studies that were done, and they're available on the Carbon Policy Office website that look at, both historically how programs like this implemented in other jurisdictions, what economic impacts have been experienced, as well as, a projection of what a program like this applied to Oregon's economy would likely to experience. And what those studies have shown is negligible to positive economic impacts over the long term from programs like this, primarily because they drive greater efficiencies, people save energy, they reduce their fuel consumption, and that behavioral response, as well as the emergence of new and better, cleaner technologies, over the long term actually situates both households and the economy for greater efficiency and more growth.
Hey, John. So we have 4 more people in the queue. Can we move on and come back?
Yeah, 'cause I'm not finished.
There's a lot of great information. I mean, I spent a lot of time at Christmas break going over all the resources in the Carbon Policy Office website. It is amazing, starting with kind of 101 on how the market works, all the way through these nuances of what's currently happening. So I do encourage everyone to go to that website. It's a great 101 all the way to the more sophisticated reports. Some things, massive formulas I didn't understand, but Shelby, you want to go next?
I have 2 questions, hopefully quick ones. So thank you very much for the information, that was very helpful. And apologies if you had mentioned this in your discussion, I was writing very quickly. So the legislature has determined or is determining its priorities within the 2 funds, but who actually makes the selection of projects?
Great question, and thanks for the opportunity to clarify. So, what the bill currently says is that every 2 years, the implementing agency will do a report that outlines, based on the available science and economics, sort of where there are opportunities to achieve the goals of the program, to reduce emissions, sequester carbon, and adapt to climate change. So there'll be a report that gets done every 2 years, that's issued both to the governor and to the legislature and to the state's existing environmental justice task force. At that point, the Environmental Justice Task Force will review those sort of technical opportunities through the lens of environmental and social justice, and will issue its own recommendations on priorities, particularly those that can benefit those impacted communities. And it will issue its report to the governor and the legislature. And then decisions about which projects do or don't get prioritized for funding with proceeds that are available in those funds, will get reflected in the traditional budget process. So the Joint Committee, what's currently the Joint Committee on Carbon Reduction, which is envisioned to become the Joint Committee on Climate Action moving forward, that committee will issue recommendations. They'll take in that report and those recommendations both from the implementing agency and the Environmental Justice Task Force, and they will make their own recommendations about how they would like to see proceeds from from the sale of allowances in those 2 funds, how they would like to see that spent. And then on the transportation side, there is a role for our Oregon Transportation Commission, since the Transportation Decarbonization Account sits within the Highway Trust Fund, and they oversee the state's Highway Trust Fund. The Oregon Transportation Commission will make recommendations on those funds, 50% of which must be spent on sort of state transportation related projects. The other 50% must be made available for city, county, local transportation projects through a sort of a grant funded type program where there'll be an application process that they'll develop, and entities can apply for funding from that fund through the Oregon Transportation Commission. So the short answer is it's the legislature at the end of the day will make recommendations. The Oregon Transportation Commission is overseeing the grant funding of the monies in the Transportation Decarbonization Account. And we could potentially see some of the priorities, the governor, as the governor does her or his in the future requested budget, you might see priorities reflected in the governor's requested budget as well, based on those recommendations that come through. So there'll be different avenues in which prioritization happens, but the legislature at the end of the day, through the traditional budget Ways and Means process, makes the final decisions.
Great, thank you.
Just a quick follow-up.
She really has to go, so I'll make sure you.
Sorry.
We're okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I think you just answered this question, but I just want to confirm. So with the Transportation Decarbonization Fund, that is intended to support the goals of the bill, so it's not kind of any transportation needs.
Correct.
That could be applied.
Right. So, the funding in the transportation decarbonization account, it's constitutionally restricted so that it must be spent within the highway right of way.